Hello and welcome once again to our webinar presentation. My name is Scott Tingey and I'll be your host today as we discuss the many fundamentals of the drapery business, ranging from fabric selection to finished product. I know we have several new decorators as well as many seasoned sellers, so I hope the content will be meaningful to all. So in today's webinar, what we'd like to do is break it into three sections. Section 1 will be what makes a drapery custom, and we'll discuss things such as selecting the right fabric, selecting the correct drapery linings, quality fabrication, and Carroll drapery styles. Part 2 will be measuring considerations, and we'll talk about the basic measuring and also measuring for accent panels. Nothing too tricky, but basically Drapery 101. And then finally, I'd like to show you how placing an order through our CarrollNet system can save you time, save you money, reduce paperwork, and make less errors. So let's start today by talking about what makes a drapery custom. First of all, the thing that comes to mind is selecting the right fabric. I put this fabric image up here along with our logo just to point out that we've been in the business since 1958, so we've had a little bit of time to get that right. So I hope what we talk about today, although fundamental, will help you out when you're thinking about selecting the right kind of fabric for a drapery order. So when we talked about selecting the right fabric, the first thing we want to maybe keep in consideration are material characteristics. So what I'd like to do today is just talk about some of them. So for example, natural fibers, we think of cotton. When we think of cotton, well, there's some advantages and disadvantages, but let's discuss a few of the advantages. Cotton is a very stable and durable fabric. It resists moss and abrasions. It's non-static and comes in a wide range of weights and textures, design patterns, and it drapes very nicely. If there were some disadvantages, as we probably all know, cotton can fade and rot in the sun and can also mildew. So therefore, we strongly suggest to line all drapery, especially when subjected to the sun's UV rays. Another fiber that you might recognize through the picture is linen. Linen is a great fabric and very popular, and you see it just about everywhere. Some of the advantages of linen is very strong and durable. Linen is also a non-static and resists moss, and it does resist sun rot. It's very much in trend and has a large color palette. We have several books of linen in our line, and although some of them are blends, just a large selection, and it just dyes beautifully. It's a gorgeous fabric. Some of the disadvantages, and I think you probably know what they are, but that linen can fade in the sun and can wrinkle, as is the nature of linen. Using linen blends, as I mentioned earlier, with cotton or polyester, as an example, will reduce this effect. But here again, we strongly suggest ordering lining with any linen drapery. So by the picture, you can tell this next natural fiber product is silk. Silk's a wonderful fabric. You know, the advantage is that silk is actually long-lasting if handled correctly. It resists abrasion and moss, and it colors great. And silk has a hand all of its own. I'm sure if you've ever felt and folded and kind of feel the hand of silk, it has a unique feel to it. It's a wonderful fabric, and it dyes so beautifully. Some of the disadvantages can be that silk will fade and rot in sunlight and will wrinkle and pick up static electricity. We always tell you if you're using silk for drapery, you should both interline and line to protect from the sun's UV rays. You should never steam or press with a hot iron, but hand dress silk to perfection. Now let's take a second and talk about some of the synthetic fibers that you'll find in drapery fabrics. So when you look at this one, it's pretty obvious, but this would be polyester. You see a lot of polyester in the fabrics today, and there really are some great advantages to polyester. Some that come to mind is polyester is very stable and durable. It's sun-fast and wrinkle-proof for the most part. It also resists abrasion, flame, mildew, and sun rot, often referred to as a faux silk. Often polyester is used as a blend with cotton, linen, and other fine fabrics. But if you look at that picture, this is what we would kind of title an embroidered faux silk. If you wanted to talk about some of the disadvantages, well, some polyesters will not hold a pleat fold as well, and it's more casual in the way it hangs, but I'm going to mention not all. We have polyesters in the line now that when you feel them with your hand, you really can't tell that it is polyester for the most part. So you can't always judge a fabric by its past reputation or, you know, the bad rap that polyester's had. We actually have some very beautiful fabrics that have polyester. Then there's rain and viscose. When you see rain and viscose, basically the advantages mostly lay toward the rayon, and that's used as a blend in adding stability to fabrics such as your linen and cotton, and it's also blended with other synthetic fabrics such as polyester. And not really a disadvantage, but you'll normally never see rayon used as the only fiber to make a drapery, so it's always usually a blend along with viscose to blend with other fibers. So along with selecting the right fabric, some other considerations might be when we talk about actually making the drapery, what types of fabrics are going to make it perform or hang in a certain manner. So when we talk about some maybe more of the more traditional, we think of very tailored vertical pleat folds that will traverse and hang, a ½ inch off the floor. Well, when I think of fabrics that might work well for that, certainly the cottons, the cotton poly blends, the linen blends, and any fabric in general that will hold a fold and in general is more stable, work well for that type of traditional, the 3-finger pleat, the very formal looking draperies. Now, casual panels with a more relaxed look and not a structured pleat fold look. So it's important to point out that not everybody is for option A, the very detailed, sometimes they say like my grandmother's draperies, whatever. They're looking for something that's got a little more casualness to it and sometimes maybe a little more modern feel to it. But for example, if I was doing casual panels with a more relaxed look and not a structured pleat fold look, then I could entertain some of the polyesters or any other fabrics that have a tendency not to hold a fold or a crease. They have a little, I don't want to use the word billow, but they flare a little bit. Some people like that look. They like an unstructured pleat heading look. They don't want things to hang in, nice magazine pleats. But just as a little side note, you can still use like polyesters for shears and things like that. And there are solutions to help it hang in very nice folds. And one that we have at Carroll Fabrics is called memory stitching. Most of you know what that is, but that's a method by which we can treat the back of the drapery with a for lack of a better term, a little string that goes from pleat to pleat to pleat on the back side of the drapery, and therefore it helps the drapery hold its folds and pleats a lot nicer. Then there's the stationary accent panel that you desire to break or puddle onto the floor. When I use the term break, that means maybe hanging an inch onto the floor, and certainly we know the term puddle is more kind of a Euro feeling to it, where you might have 12 to 15, 16, 18 inches, who knows, onto the floor. That makes a nice puddling effect. Well, all fabrics can do that because you have strict control over how that hangs. Once it hits the floor, you're in control. Another good practice when we talk about fabric and how it will perform is just to be able to have what we call the feel of the hand. And depending on the type of sample books that you're working with, sometimes you can take the sample out of the binder, out of the ring binder, sometimes you can't. But usually where you can actually get your hand onto it and feel it, you can get a feel. Is it stiff? Is it soft? Is it has a nice buttery feel to it? Is it going to hang beautifully? Will it hold a crease? You can make all those decisions sometimes just by the hand. And another good common practice is when you're working with 118-inch wide goods, especially shears. They always sample shears in just a flat piece of fabric, but the only way to see what color it's going to look like on the window is actually taking it and folding it up in your hand into layers, and that gives you the true hue or the true color that's going to come when it's on the window. So that's always a good practice to employ when you're working with seamless shears. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. We've discussed some of the fabric characteristics and the different types of natural and synthetic fibers and what type of drapery scenarios might work, pleated draperies for formal or more casual. But what we want to talk about now is linings. We always do a real good job of picking out fabrics, but sometimes linings can be very important to the quality of a drapery. So in general, let's just talk about some of these. Linings obviously add more fullness and body to pleats and folds because it's an additional layer of material. I think that makes sense. Drapery linings also add an aesthetically pleasing look from the outside looking in. So if we look at the Carroll lining books, in this case, what we would tell you that all Carroll linings are applicable for that because they all add fullness to the body and they all add additional weight, which is a good thing. Another way to look at lining is also the protection from the sun. Fabric is often left neglected to battle against the sun. You think about people that order unlined draperies to try to save on a few bucks, but really in the long run it's cost them a lot more money. Drapery linings help protect against the sun deterioration by decreasing the amount of exposure to the face fabric, and sometimes we forget that sun UV rays also gets on the upholstery, the carpets, and furniture. So here again, all of the Carol linings in the Carol program would help to protect from the sun. So very important to always remember that you want to line draperies. It's pretty rare that you don't. So I know even on our order entry system that we automatically check the lining box for you. You have to uncheck it. That's how important we think having a lined drapery is. Now, in addition to the other things that we've talked about lining, let's talk about extra weight. The extra weight that drapery linings add helps a drapery to hang beautifully. In general, the more weight you have with a drapery, for the most part, it helps the pleats and everything hang a lot better. So just adding the extra weight that drapery linings add will help the drapery hang beautifully. Another consideration is moisture. Lined draperies fight off condensation and moisture that often seeps in through windows when they're with their water repellent finish. These linings act as a protective layer for the expensive face fabrics. Now, we have specific linings in our program that actually work well to fight off condensation. Their names are Classic Sateen, Rocklon Rain No Stain, another lining called Pinnacle, and another lining that we call Premier Line. All of those, if you look on the back of the little tab that's on the back of the lining book, or on the back of the sample swatch itself, will illustrate that they are very much water repellent and those types of properties. Another consideration when we're working with lining is the sound absorption. Multiple layers of coated and blackout linings reduce sound. Many of the homes today actually have theater rooms, and whatever the reason is, where they just want a very nice room that absorbs sound, that's nice and quiet. That can be accomplished by a number of linings that we have at Carol Fabrics. Certainly all blackout linings would fit that scenario. We have a lining called Carol Suede. You may have heard of it as thermal suede. We have a lining called Hydra. Hydra is like a 50% inner lining cotton flannel feel on one side and more of a classic sateen feel to the other side. Then, of course, we have 5-ounce, 6-ounce flannel inner lining, and we also have bump cloth. So all of those would work well as far as sound absorption if you're building a theater room and things like that. So let's talk just a little bit about who benefits from blackout linings. BDLs, or blackout drapery linings, do not just target one customer niche, but are recommended for just about anyone, including but not limited to, and think about these, hospital personnel, pilots, police, firefighters, or people in general who work shifts. Another thing to think about are seniors who need to maintain a good quality of life and good health. They need their sleep. Infants who have not yet developed a proper sleep cycle. And in general, anyone who requires a good day or a good night's sleep. We have some wonderful blackout linings in the Carol line, and the applicable ones are what we call the budget blackout, our out black, and our picture blackout linings. Let's talk a little bit about flame resistant linings. Sometimes when you're selling an order, you have the opportunity or you need to use flame retardant fabrics for certain situations. So at Carol, we do have certain linings that are available in flame resistant, or you'll see the term FR. The flame resistant finishes passes all federal, state, and local fire codes for the utmost security. In general, what you're looking for are linings that are tagged NFPA 701, and that's a standard method for fire tests that's used for just about every state in the United States. We do have 3 basic categories of blackout lining. The first one, if you need a blackout property, it's called budget blackout, FR. If you're just looking for a standard drapery, like if you're going to do a standard drapery on a window, in this case it just needs to be FR, that standard lining would be one that we call Sleep Safe FR. And then if you're looking for a little energy pickup, a little more energy efficient lining, then we have what we call the Thermal Suede FR. But here again, it covers all 3 categories: your blackout, your standard lining, and your energy type lining. So that's kind of a look at all the drapery linings and what the applicable uses might be. But another thing to keep in consideration is when you sell custom draperies, and what you'll be commonly asked is, how often do I need to clean my draperies? And I can best answer those questions with these 3 little comments. Many draperies are unnecessarily dry cleaned. A regular soft brushing or careful vacuum cleaning will generally keep draperies looking bright and new for many, many seasons. But to keep in mind, if it does become necessary to have them cleaned, be sure to use a professional dry cleaner. Don't take it down to the corner laundromat or laundry mart or whatever, and throw them in a washing machine. Coin-operated machines, will just harm very expensive face fabric and the thread, etc. It's just not a way to go. But I can tell you, unless you have a home where there's a lot of smoke or a lot of air particulates, whether it's grease from cooking, what have you, most times you can just take a vacuum cleaning and do it twice a year, and you'll, like I stated in the first paragraph, your draperies will maintain a new and bright look to them for many, many seasons. Okay, so if we review just for a second what we've talked about so far, we've talked about some of the fabric characteristics, whether they're natural or synthetics. We talked about different lining usages. We've talked about care and cleaning for draperies, but let's get into some of the construction and really what makes a custom drapery. So for example, if we talked about specifications, custom fullness, which we'll talk about a little more in depth, is very important to a custom drapery. Pattern matching, double-turned headings, double-turned bottom hems and sides, using weights at the corners and seams, using a quality cotton thread, and most of all, manufacturing in a state-of-the-art workroom utilizing some of the nicest and most modern equipment in the industry today. So what I'd like to do is kind of take you through some of that. So what I'd like to do is take you through a workroom tour, kind of give you an idea of what's underneath the roof at our workroom in Augusta, Georgia, and kind of talk about those things that we just talked about as far as what makes a good custom drapery. So if you were to come in our workroom, one of the big unique advantages that we have at Carroll Fabrics is all of our fabrics under the same roof as our workroom, and we fill it with a 95% order fill rate. So if you just think about that on its surface, if you look at all these fabrics in the bin, if you were to be in the plant, if you were in the plant I should say, you'd see up to 50 to 55 rows that look just like this, that are just stuffed with the different fabrics. You'll also notice that the bolts are in the bin in a horizontal position, which is directly opposite of what you'd see in a fabric store. We do that to keep the wrinkles, what we call bolt wrinkles. Sometimes if they're standing straight up, the fabric tries to shimmy down the bolt, and at the bottom of the bolt it leaves wrinkles that are very, very hard to get out. So everything's laid horizontal. You see the little tags hanging off. They all have barcodes. So every inch of fabric is kept on a computer. We know when to do reorder points, all those good things. And really what they add into is making sure that we have at least a 95% order fill rate. Think of this one too. If we were making your drapery and then there was a flaw in the fabric, an unforeseen flaw, or heaven forbid the cutter cut it too short, we only need to walk over one passageway, pull the bolt again and cut that same fabric. We know what dial out, what bolt it came out of. So there are some very unique advantages for using the workroom and having the fabric under the same roof. Another thing in our workroom after you leave the fabric inventory area is you come out to our cutting area, and this kind of begins the state-of-the-art workroom. And people ask me all the time, how are we able to manufacture product and ship it in under 10 working days? It all begins in the cutting department. What we do is a thing called consolidated cutting, and what's happening here is this young lady is actually cutting the fabric. Say the order came in, it was for draperies, bedspreads, swags, or whatever the scenario might be. She actually cuts for all the departments, matching the pattern and doing all the things necessary to make a custom product. And what happens, each one of the individual departments receives their fabric on the same day so they can immediately start to work on it. And that's just one of the things that we do to make, to ensure that we manufacture all our product in 10 working days or less. For some of you new people that are out there, what you're looking at is a bolt of fabric on the table. And normally prints, just about all fabrics now come 54 inches wide. There are some exceptions, of course, but that's a 54-inch wide piece of fabric. So what happens is, if you were to roll it off the bolt and cut it, that's what in the industry what we'd call one width of fabric. So if you needed 3 widths of fabric all the same length, she would roll it out 3 different times and cut it, and that would be 3 widths of material. So as you can also see, we have the ability to cut extra wide lining, do lots of different things with the equipment that we have here. In addition to 54-inch wide fabrics, 55-inch, 56, they vary sometimes. There's also in the industry fabrics that we kind of identify as being wide width, and they're usually about 118 inches wide. They don't have to be. Sometimes you'll see them 106, 108, but in general, most of the shears, for example, are 118 inches wide. That's kind of what we'll talk about in this slide here. So for example, the typical width of a material is 118 inches wide, and that's most often seen in sheer material. The 118-inch width is actually turned 90 degrees, and then it's used for length, and this is what we call railroading the material. So a little example for you could see where we take that bolt and turn it and stand it straight up, and then if, say, the bolt had 60 yards on it, we could theoretically roll that fabric out for 60 yards and not have any seams. That's also a nickname that you've heard throughout the years, seamless shears, and that's how that's accomplished. In addition, think about this. If that material is 118 inches wide, when we turn it up and down, the maximum length that we can actually make from that piece of material is only 90, well, I shouldn't say only, but 99 inches. That's because the difference between the 118 and the 99 at that point is used to make your headings and your hems. So when you see maximum lengths put at 99 inches for 118 inches, sometimes it's a little less for goods that are less than 118 inches wide, you'll know that's what that's all about. And in addition, we usually take seamless shears like that and pleat it to 3-to-1 fullness. And really what that means is the fuller the drapery, or 3-to-1 fullness, which looks great for shears, you get bigger pleats or more fabric in the pleat itself, and the space between the pleat becomes a little bit narrower, which overall gives the drapery a lot more fullness. One thing of note is to keep in mind that the Carroll sample books that we book our 118-inch material in are shown already in the railroaded position. So if your consumer or your client's looking at a fabric book, the way it's booked in the book is the way it will hang after we railroad it. So, continuing on with our little tour of the workroom, what's going on here? These are joiners or sergers. You've probably been in workrooms where you see a lot of people just sitting at their sewing machine, kind of hunched over a machine and feeding it through a serger or a joiner. You'll notice that most of the machinery and equipment at Carroll Fabrics, our operators actually stand at their position, and they actually prefer to do that. As you can see, they're on top of a big rubber mat. But this way, what they do is actually feed it into this machine. Those are actually conveyor belts, and they're digitally controlled. So they actually know where to set the machines and can read it digitally, versus the old days where you take your hand and you just crank a knob here, crank a knob there, which creates a bigger bite or a lesser bite. The end result, you get nice low profile seams with very, hopefully none at all, minimal puckering in the seams. And this is what we call joining. At the next station, here again, looks like the same machine, but it's not. At this particular machine, this is what we're doing, where we're doing bottom hemming or blind stitching, you know, the double 4-inch hems on the bottom or the 1.5-inch side hems. And it's done the same way. You can actually see in the picture, you can see that little digital readout if you look close enough. But this young lady is actually standing on, you know, standing up and feeding into like a conveyor belt system, and where the fabric is actually run through this very modern blind stitch machine, if you will, and just makes beautiful stitching where it's hardly noticeable, if at all, on the other side of the material. So this is what we call our blind stitching or a bottom hemming station. This next station is what we call our gravity table. All those of you that have worked in workrooms, you know that is probably one of the positions that takes the longest part of making a drapery, is when you're tabling it for length and you know, those various things that are done at that operation. Well, this is what we call a gravity table, and what's really cool about this machine is if the bar up on the top actually slides down to the bottom of the table, and that's where she clamps in her bottom hems. She puts a length into the controller box, if you will, and that bar takes the drapery back up to the top, and you know, it stops at a certain length, and that's where she can fold in her heading. And if you look all the way down on the left-hand side, you can actually see the buckram. That's a buckram that's placed in that hem, or in that top heading style, where she can double turn it. And one of the things that's cool about this is you can put up to 5 or 6 widths continually on one table, where in smaller workrooms, and some that I've actually run in the past, where the table's flat, it's only 54 inches wide, so you can only table 54 inches of material at a time. Then you have to undo it, unclamp it, move it over, reclamp it, kind of straighten it out again. And what you fight all the time is a thing in this industry that we call uneven hems. So that's what's cool about the gravity table. You don't have the uneven, I guess it's possible, but you pretty much eliminate the uneven hems, because all that stretchiness or whatever, the loose weave of the fabric, if you will, all kind of falls out during the tabling process. And then just to kind of follow the order of production, you know, we serged it, we put the bottom hems in. I just showed you how we table it. And then when it comes off the tabling and it's got the lining in it, it's time to put the side hems down the side. And we actually do what we call a rolled side hem. And in here we're using that same type of blind stitch machine. You can see the operator's actually standing and puts in a very, very nice side hem where you can barely notice the material thread from the outside, the cotton thread that we use on the side hems. I might mention also that if you look up throughout our plant, you'll see a lot of signs that hang. So we do a lot of things under the quality control scenario. So an operator would probably look up, depending on what station she's at, and they'd have signs that relate to the station where she's working. In this case here, it might be, what an acceptable side hem would look like versus what an unacceptable side hem would look like. So at all stations, all the operators have little reminders of what quality is and what quality control is. So just thought I'd point that out for you. So then finally, after all the drapery goes through all the different production steps that I showed you, then it actually goes to an actual person that hangs it up in what we call final inspection. And you'll notice you can see the inspection racks that are in the plant there. You can see that they're all backlit by fluorescent bulbs. And what that does, it kind of imitates light coming through the window as if they were hanging in your home with the sun. We look for lots of different things. We look in case there's any material that got pinched between the lining and the drapery. We look for any flaws that might be in the material. We check it for length. You can see on the bottom that's actually hanging at a certain length, so she's looking to see that it's got nice even hems. But here again, all that's done, and then once that's done, she takes it down and it goes to a station where they fold it, and we'll actually pin the draperies for you at no additional charge. So I just showed you how we build a basic drapery, but there's lots of other things that go on. We think of embellishing when we're doing things in the workroom or when you're out there selling. And what I did is I just put up a picture of one of the ads that I think we put this in Veranda magazine, but it just shows you some of the things that we do. So for example, what I'm trying to point out here is banding. We recommend that your banding is 2 inches wide. That's what we seem to do the best with. And you can put that banding, you can inset it 1.5 inches from the leading edge, or you can apply it directly to the leading edge as shown in this picture. So it gives you a couple of ways to go on that. At Carroll, we offer 3 different directional styles, however. So when you work with Carroll, you'll learn that style A means that the banding's running vertical. So if you're to look at the draperies, you can see that the banding's running vertically down the leading edge. Style B means that the banding's running horizontal. Although we didn't do that on the drapery, but that style B would work the same way for the top treatments. As you can see that the banding's running horizontally on the top treatments. Then hypothetically, you could order style C, and if it was on the drapery, what that means is that the banding runs both vertically, and then it'll have a 45-degree miter, and then run horizontally over on the bottom hem. So lots of ways to do that. We have a wonderful fancy department that does a lot of those neat kind of things, and very much state-of-the-art. So here again, once those draperies, we took a little side trip over to the embellishment department, put some banding on. But once the draperies are done, just a reminder, all that's done and everything that I've showed you is done in 10 working days or less. So now they're ready to ship. They actually come over to a little consolidation area. Everything's done by barcode electronically. This young lady here is scanning each one of the draperies to make sure that your order is complete. Once it's complete, we think we put it in the best packaging in our industry. Trust me, we spend a lot of money on this, and I would just say for those of you that do business with us, and if you've had the opportunity to receive some of our draperies and our packaging, I think you'd testify to what a unique system that we use. But basically what this is, there's little lock, it's a box in a box with little locks that hold the drapery in place. So when UPS and carriers pick it up, and they, sometimes they're not as, I don't know the word, they're not as nice to boxes as they should be, but your drapery arrives in a good condition. Now this is not to say that an installer doesn't have some dressing to do, because he could go to a local workroom around the corner and still has to dress out draperies. We just say there's not a lot of difference between the two. We really get them there in first-class shape, which we like to say best-in-class packaging. So now let's just dive into a little bit. We've talked about, we showed you how to make the drapery and all that good stuff, and we boxed, packaged it, got it ready to go for you. But, when we talked earlier about some fullness, I wanted to take just a few minutes and talk about fullness during this webinar. So pleated drapery comes with a fullness built in, meaning when you order something from Carroll Fabrics, the fullness is going to be built in. Typical fullness could be 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1, 3 to 1, depending on the product that you're using. But with Carol, you can select the fullness percent, or you can specify the number of fabric widths. What do I mean by that? Well, some of you that have been in the business for a long, long time like to dictate the number of fabric widths you want used in a certain given width drapery, a certain size drapery. Others have kind of been brought up, say, hey, workroom, I don't care what you do, but just make sure you put 2.5 to 1 fullness in it. So we can work either way with you, so I think that's really pretty cool. But always measure the drapery to fit the rod. Never measure the drapery at the bottom. And here's what happens. Sometimes if a consumer measures their drapery, they don't want to get on a ladder and climb all the way to the top. So what happens, they take a drapery that's already got the fullness built in, it's hanging on a rod, they go down to the bottom of the drapery and they pull it apart, and then they'll give you that, say they pull it apart and it's 200 inches. Then you put 200 inches on your order form, and then also tell us to apply 2.5 to 1 fullness. Then all of a sudden you get back a 500-inch drapery when it was really only 200 inches where they spread it apart. So what we're asking, if that doesn't make sense, really all we're asking you to do is remember to measure the rod, the top of the rod. Give us the amount of inches that it needs to cover to include your returns and your overlaps, and then we will apply the applicable fullness. You'll tell us what it is, or or by telling us the number of fabric widths to use. So never, ever, ever measure the drapery at the bottom and then apply a fullness factor to that. Hope that makes sense to you. In addition to pleated drapery fullness, using rod pocket header type, for draperies, talking about fullness is somewhat the same. So on non-pleated headings, if you will, rod pockets, etc., the fullness is the amount of additional fabric built in so it's not flat when it's covering the required space. Think about those homes in new neighborhoods sometimes when you just see a sheet on the window, there's no fullness in the drapery. Well, that would be a 1-to-1 fullness, just flat on the window. So what we're asking you here again is to give us the rod size, or the amount of space that you want to cover, and then just tell us the fullness percent you want to use. So I did a little example. If you told us or specified to us that you wanted 2-to-1 fullness and you ordered the panel 50 inches wide, when you laid it out flat, when you received it, it would be 100 inches wide, or 2-to-1 fullness, 100 inches to fit 50. So I hope that makes some sense. That's kind of how we play it with the non-pleated headings. Next, I'd like to talk just a second about some of the different drapery styles that we have at Carol Fabrics. And I think one of the big call-outs here is that you can get lengths up to 235 inches from our workroom. And that really takes, lack of a better term, the department stores, the box stores out of play, because you can get those longer lengths. We offer, in the pleated category, some great product. There's a traditional 3-finger pleat. There's a 2-finger pleat with just a 2-finger fold. You've got the inverted pleat where it's tacked at the top versus the bottom. And the single pleat's been pretty popular also. In the draperies that I just showed you, the different pleated styles that you can get at Carol Fabrics, also want to point out a couple of things. The reason I showed you those is that they were all pleated, and in doing so they all have crinoline or buckram in it. And I guess it depends on what part of the country, whether you call it crinoline or buckram, but it's the exact same thing. It's basically, for lack of a better way of saying it, a 4-inch wide kind of a paper, woven paper, that actually goes into the pleated headings. And there's some really fundamental information that you need to remember when you're doing pleated draperies. In general, you're basically going to install it, especially if they're traversing. They're going to go on what we call a white traverse rod. You probably have all seen that. Or they're going to go on some type of decorator rod. Whether it's pulled by a cord or pulled by a baton, doesn't matter. But if you'll notice in the top picture, that's a standard white rod. And when the draperies are coming to like the open position, the space between the pleats has to go somewhere. So it has to crease and come to the front. If you look at that picture close enough, you'll see that it's breaking and coming to the front. The installer actually has to, or who's ever installing it, actually has to put the drapery into that position, take his hands and crease that between each pleat and crease that buckram, so that when it operates, when it opens and closes, it will kind of accordion fold. The drapery will open very nicely and also close very nicely. When you're using a decorator rod, you might notice that the buckram, or the space in between the pleats, is actually folding backwards, and that's because it can, because the buckram can actually go, the top of the drapery, if you will, can actually go backwards because it's hanging underneath the rod, where it couldn't do that on a white rod. It has to break forward. But in both cases, however, the installer, as shown at the little picture at the bottom, has to get up there, fold it, and either break it forward or break it backwards. Very fundamental. If you ever get a consumer that calls you and says, I just got my new draperies, I just opened them, they only opened about a third of the way, and they're binding up, and I look at them, the pleats are all crooked. Well, what's happening is the buckram hasn't been trained. The pleats, some of the folds are trying to go forward, some are trying to go backwards. You might even find part of one going backwards, another one breaking forward, and it's just a mess. So that's a very, very key fundamental thing that needs to be done to draperies when installing. So we talked about some of the pleated drapery headings and the fact that they have buckram in them, and some of the uniqueness of that. But we also have what we call casual pleated heading styles. And for the most part, they don't have buckram. But if you look at them, they just, people kind of migrate to some of these things nowadays because they don't want that old traditional look. I shouldn't say a lot of them do, but some of them go to this type of look because they want something a little bit different, a little bit more casual looking. But here again, you can even get lengths up to 235 inches on these. So some of those are the relaxed pleat, the tuxedo pleat, and I think we even have some more. Additionally, we have some other casual style or non-pleated drapery headings. Just like the two that I showed you, we also have the rod pocket, which is a staple. It's been in our industry a long time, and rod pockets are used for a lot of things. Stretch panels on doors, hourglasses, lots of different things. A lot of times people will use a rod pocket if they're selling a stripe and they just want little drapery side panels, and it's going underneath the top treatment, what have you. Because a lot of times when you install it and you want a certain part of the stripe to be pronounced to the front of a pleat, you can actually get in there and kind of maneuver it because you're sharing it on a rod. Of course, we've got the grommet top. You don't have to go very far. They're all over the place. And we also have one called the plain top. And don't want you to be confused by the picture. All a plain top drapery is just a flat piece of fabric that we double turn the heading and we pin it about every 6 to 10 inches. And it's just a very casual hang that you pin, onto decorator rings, and it's just kind of perhaps like a very casual baton draw, whatever. But we call that the plain top drapery. Next, I'd like to kind of shift gears a little bit, and let's talk about measuring for a pair of draperies. So under this scenario, we'll be measuring for a pair of drapery. It'll be traversing, complete coverage. What I mean by that, it'll open and close, totally cover the window. And we're going to use a standard corded traverse rod. I think everybody sees by the little images that the tape measure on the left is the one you want to use versus the one on the right. I'm sure you're not doing that, but just as you know from measuring, if you're using a minimum 25-inch length and 3/4 to an inch wide tape measure, when you're snaking it up the wall, it doesn't come back down and fall on your head, etc. So you want to use a good quality tape measure. Let's get into the measuring here just a little bit and try to make this as simple as possible. So step one is to measure the width of the window, including the moldings if you want. It's got a 2-inch wide molding or 4-inch wide molding on both sides. Since draperies are 99% of the time sold outside mount, just measure the width of the moldings if they have moldings, or without, just measure the width of the window. Next, as part of step one, is to determine how far past the window or moldings you want the rod to extend on each side. We recommend a minimum of 4 inches on each side. You want to go 10 inches wider, 12 inches wider, that makes no difference. And in some cases, which we'll explain in a little while, it makes perfectly good sense to do that. But as a minimum, we're saying go 4 inches on each side. So if you will, the window width plus the rod extensions on each side will equal a term that we call bracket to bracket, or you might hear it called face width. The important takeaway in this is that when you're measuring for a pair of drapery, you must extend your rod the same amount on each side of the window, and this will allow the drapery to meet in the center when it's fully closed. So if we take that example that we just talked about, so let's hypothetically say we had a window that is 80 inches wide, including the moldings. So then all I'm saying is if we take the rod extension to the left and the rod extension to the right, that would be 4 plus 4. 4 times 2 would be an additional 8 inches. So that bracket to bracket or rod face would be 88 inches. So next, in step 2, what we want to do is select a return size. This is the amount each panel will return back to the wall. Here again, a rule of thumb is 4 inches for a single rod and 6 inches for a double rod with a shear. although consult your hardware when depending on what line of hardware you do, because it might say it's 4.5 or whatever, but a rule of thumb, it's 4 inches for a single rod. So what I did is, the picture on the left shows you that return going back to the wall. That's a great feature in a custom drapery because it gives you light control, it gives you a nice clean look so you don't have a big space on the front of your drapery ending in a big space. It's just a custom way of doing things. So if you look from a top-down view on the right-hand side, you can see that all we're doing is taking the drapery return back to the wall on each side. In this case here, it was 4 inches on each side. Now, in addition to the returns going back to the wall, we also have a thing called overlaps. And what I'm trying to show you here is that we add 2 inches per panel or 4 inches to a pair to allow for overlapping. So on a drapery hardware that has corded traversing, which you'll see is what we call master carriers that are kind of over here on the left-hand side of your screen. And they're designed that they will kind of crisscross or overlap each other in the center. So over on the right, on the top-down view, what you can see is what we're doing is on this pair of drapery, we're adding an extra 2 inches in width per panel, so that allows to have a minimum of 4 inches of overlapping in the center. So now if we take everything as a whole, let's kind of review what we did. So basically what we're talking about doing is taking our bracket to bracket plus the returns and plus the overlaps. So for example, that 80-inch window where we went 4 inches on each side, that gave me a bracket to bracket of 88 inches as shown in step 1. In step 2, we're showing where the returns go back to the wall 4 inches on each side. So that's 4 inch returns times 2 is another 8 inches. And then finally in step number 3, we added 2 inches per panel or overall 4 inches for a pair. And in adding those together, we now get a finished width of 100 inches. At Carroll Fabrics, that's what we're looking for, is what we call the finished width, including the overlaps and the returns, and that would be the specified measurement that you would give us, and we would build you a drapery to fit the scenario that we just did here. Next, I'd like to talk to you about some of the exceptions to what we just spoke about. In draperies, there's always exceptions, isn't there? So for example, if you're using a decorator rod, you should order your drapery 2 inches wider so that the last ring can be on the outside of the bracket. So if you look at the little diagram there, you can see that the last ring on the rod is placed on the outside of the bracket. Since this was a pair, you'd have the same thing going on the other side of the drapery. So if you were to do the math, basically let's take our 80-inch window. We did 2 4-inch returns, we extended the rod out 4 inches on each side, which gave us 8 inches. Then we had a bracket to bracket of 88. Then we added the returns, which were 4 inches times 2. Then we added the overlaps, which were 2 inches per panel, but since it was a pair, it'd be a total of 4. And then all we're saying, in addition to that, now we're going to add an extra inch to account for the ring going on the outside of each bracket when using a decorator rod, or what we call a ring allowance. So under that scenario, you'd have a total finished width of 102, where earlier it was only 100. All we did was add an additional 2 inches to allow for the ring to be on the outside of the bracket. Another exception that I think is really pretty important, especially because of the type of hardware that's used now, and that's if you're using a pleated style drapery without pull cords. In other words, a rod that you're opening by a baton or something of that nature, hand drawn if you will. And in that case, we suggest that you add 3 to 6 inches of extra width to the drapery. And the reason is because we use buckram, and in a pleated drapery, it has a tendency to draw or relax panels open. The deal is, on a corded traverse rod and those master carriers that I showed you earlier, they keep that drapery closed, and the fabric isn't strong enough to relax back open. But when you don't have that, you don't have a corded traverse rod and it's just on rings all by itself, there's no cords or whatever, that buckram that's in the drapery actually tries to relax back open. So hypothetically, if you had it closed in the center, you walked away and you come back, and then you'll see that the draperies have actually kind of opened up in the middle by 2 or 3 inches, which is a big light gap, no privacy. So to counter that, That's why we always say add 3 to 6 inches extra width to your drapery to account that relaxation. So if we did the math once more, we'll start off again. We had the 80-inch window. We went 4 inches past the window on each side. Gave us our 88-inch bracket to bracket, our 2 returns, our 4 inches in overlap, and then we had that 2-inch decorator rod. And now in addition, we're going to add a little relaxation of 3 inches, 3 to 6. In this case I did 3 because I've got a non-corded rod. That now gives me a total finish width of 105. So you can see as these little exceptions play out, all we're doing is adding a little bit extra width to accommodate for certain scenarios, on decorator rods and buckram and those types of things. Okay. So one more exception I want to talk about as it pertains to a pair of draperies is the situation when you go in and you go into a consumer's home, and their window is very important to them. It can be a source of light, a source of decor, a source of scale, lots of different reasons. And a lot of times they're going to tell you, I don't care what you do, when I want to open my draperies, I want them to stack completely off the glass. They might have a beautiful view of a golf course, their backyard, whatever it might be. But the worst thing you can do is order a pair of draperies that when they open them, they don't clearly stack off the glass or stack off the window, and that usually results in a callback. So I believe this is an old chart from the Kirsch company, but it works very well. This basically was for like 2.5 to 1 fullness draperies. And the way it works, so for example, we had that 80-inch drapery. So I'll just kind of run something. We had that window that was 80 inches. So at this point, you'd take that window width, you'd go down till you find a number that's close to that. We would use 84. And at that point, at the 84, it says to add 37 inches. So I'm going to add 37 inches to the width of my drapery. And that gives me a bracket to bracket now of 117 inches. So from there, what I'll do is I'll add my 2-inch return or my 4-inch returns twice. I'll add my overlaps that are 4 inches. In this case here, if I'm not doing a decorator or whatever, it's just my total finish width would be 129 inches. So the call out here is you went from window width, which was 80. At this point, you didn't need to worry that I'm going 4 out on each side because we're going to go 37 inches wider, which since it's a pair, half would go on one side of the rod. The other half of the 37 inches would go on the other side of the rod. And that just gave me an overall rod width of 117 inches. Added my returns, added my overlaps, and bingo, I have a finished width of 129 inches, which is cool because now when the consumer comes home and she opens her draperies, they stack off the glass and everybody's happy. So what we've done so far is all we've talked about is a pair of drapery. But we also know in the industry there's lots of opportunities to use panels, or also known as one-way draws. So in a one-way draw, a lot of the rules are the same, but let's kind of look at them real quick. So if we're going to do that same scenario, it's traversing, it's full coverage, it's on a one-way corded pull rod. The way it would work would be, step 1, measure the width of the window to include the moldings, no different. Next, determine how far past the window you want to extend your rod on each side. Well, on a panel rod, you might want to go farther, 10 inches on one side and only 2 on the other. So one of the rules is you can do that. When using a one-way pull rod, you can extend the rod out different amounts on each side. Remember, we couldn't do it on a pair, otherwise they wouldn't meet in the center of the window. But on a one-way draw, they're only drawing one way, so it doesn't matter. So if I wanted 10 inches on the left and 2 inches on the right, I can do all that. So kind of using the same kind of diagrams, this is a diagram of a one-way draw. And in this case here, where we talked about, you can go a different amount on the left than you can on the right. As you can see here, we took that same 80-inch window. In this case, the decision was made to put the rod 4 inches to the left and 2 inches to the right. Like I said earlier, you could have gone 10 inches to the left, 4 inches to the right. Doesn't matter. It can be, they don't have to be the same like it's a pair. So the math is pretty easy down below. The window width is 80 inches. The rod extension was 4 to the left, 2 inches to the right, which gave you 6. So this now gave you a new rod size or bracket to bracket of 86 inches. Just like the pair of draperies, when you're doing a one-way pull, you still have to account for a return. The only difference is on a panel of draperies, you only have one return. And the same thing applies. Usually for a single rod, it's a 4-inch return, and for a double rod, it's 6 inches or so. But as you can see on the left-hand side, you would only have one return that you would need for a one-way pull. And on the example on the right-hand side, top-down view, you can see that all I have is one 4-inch return under this scenario. And here again, when you're using a one-way pull drapery, step 3 would be add the amount that you need for what we call the overlap. So keep in mind, on a panel of drapery, there's no draperies that are crisscrossing, so you really only need one 2-inch overlap, and that's the amount that will go on the master carrier and just slide past the edge of the rod as shown. So now, taking all those previous steps and putting them together, you can see that in step 1 we're taking the window width including the molding or rod extensions, and that came out to 86 inches, which is the 80, the 4, and the 2. In step 2 you can see that we only have one 4-inch return, so under my addition here I'm only going to add one 4-inch return, and the same thing applies for the overlap. You can see that the overlap, there's only one needed because it's a panel. I'm only going to add 2 inches, so that gives me a total finished width of 92 inches for this panel, and the 92 inches, remember, includes the overlaps and return, and that's exactly the size that you would order from Carroll Fabrics. So just like with a pair of draperies, you're going to have certain exceptions that apply when you're doing one-way draws, and you'll see that these are very similar, but the difference is there's only one. So for example, if you're using a pleated style drapery on a decorator rod, you'll notice that that ring resides on the outside of the bracket. So in this case here, you'd add 1 inch width to accommodate for the end ring to be placed on that outside of the bracket. So the math is very simple. Remember, we had our 80-inch window. We had 6 inches in rod extensions, 4 to the left, 2 to the right. Give me a rod face of 86. I added only one 4-inch return. I added only one 2-inch overlap. And now I'm just going to add 1 inch extra because it's only on one side for that extra decorator rod and ring, and that gives me a total finished width of 93 inches. And that's here again the measurement that you would order when placing your order with Carroll. Just as we did in the pair of draperies, there's the exception when you're using a pleated style drapery without pull cords, or if it's, in other words, saying you're pulling it by a wand or baton or by hand, whatever you're doing. And here again, because of that buckram, we're suggesting that you add 3 to 6 inches to the width of the drapery. And that's because the buckram that's in there in the pleated drapery has a tendency to draw or relax back open, just like it did when you're doing a pair of draperies. So here again, the math becomes very simple. Just kind of repeat this. I know it's kind of being redundant, but sometimes when we see it a lot, it starts to sink in. You've got an 80-inch window. We did our 6 inches for our rod extensions, had a bracket to bracket of 86, a 4-inch return on the left only, a 2-inch return only, overlap only. In this case here, remember the 1-inch ring allowance that we made, and then we'd add 3 more inches for this relaxation so they won't creep back open. I would now have an order finish width of 96. So you can see how all these little exceptions, they're not really big, but you know, if drapery's an inch too narrow or 3 inches too narrow because we forgot to add a little thing to it, they can be very, very important things to remember. So one last exception I'd like to talk about for a drapery panel is the scenario where that when you open the drapery, it has to completely clear off the glass or clear the window. Here again, you can use this stacking chart available. We can email it to you if you want it or what have you, but it's very handy. So in this case here, if you remember, we have an 80-inch window. So we would just take the width of the window or the window opening. In this case here, it's 84. It's the closest thing to 80. And it's telling us that we need to add 37 inches, so I'm going to add my 37 inches. So that's now going to give me a bracket to bracket of 117. So in other words, the width of my rod is going to be 117 inches. And for this scenario, we're just going to say we've got one 4-inch return, we've got one 2-inch overlap, and that's all. So that would give us a total finished width of 123 inches wide. Keep in mind, if I had decorator rods, I could have added that allowance on, and you know, those types of things. But in this case here, 123 inches finished width would fit the order. So we talked a lot about the width of a drapery and you know all the different things and considerations we do there, but I think you'll agree it was pretty fundamental, pretty easy. You know, maybe in the next webinar, 201 version, if you will, we'll get into bay windows, offset pairs, things like that, but just kind of keeping with some of the fundamentals. So now let's kind of talk about drapery length. In this example, what I'm showing you is, you know, most of the drapery headings, just about all of them, are a minimum of 4 inches tall. So if you look at A where it says minimum 4 inches above the window, doesn't it make sense that I at least want to have my drapery heading 4 inches above the light line or above the window? And that's because at Carroll, when we make our draperies, we actually double turn the face fabric down on the back side. So if that hung down below the light line or whatever, you'd actually see that face fabric from the outside looking in. So 4 inches above the window is a minimum. You can go 10, 20, 100, whatever you want to do. You can just whatever, but as a minimum we say 4 inches above the window. Then you'll remember B, what we call the apron length, and what we're saying here is we want, if you had what comes to mind, you don't see it a lot anymore, but in the old bedroom draperies where you wanted the hem not to go to the floor. We always say here again, you want at least that drapery to hang a minimum of 4 inches below the sill or the light line, if you will. And the reason you do that is that's a double turned 4-inch hem. If it gets up into the light, what it does, it'll show a dark line going across because that fabric's all double folded compared to the face drapery, which is just a single layer. So for style B anyway, you want to make sure you at least go 4 inches below. Then style C is kind of the one that we're all used to, the 1/2 inch off the floor. That doesn't change. But style D and style E pertain to mostly if you're doing decorator, actually pretty much 100%, if you're doing just decorative accent panels or side hangs, a lot of different terminology for those. But if you want them to break onto the floor 1 to 2 inches, we call that like a trouser break or a break. And then if you wanted, as I mentioned earlier, a more Euro look where you want, 6 to 10 inches. So I've seen people do 18 or more. That's what we call puddling on the floor. So here's some images that I've come across that kind of shows the differences. Yeah, it looks like these are silk draperies, so I'm not sure they were the best to use in this example. They could obviously be dressed out a lot nicer. But the point is, you see the one that 1/2 inch off the floor. That's traditional. That's pretty much where people go. This is a pleated drapery. But when we talk about a trouser break, these are side panels only. You can kind of see you can do different shapes with them. And then if you're going to puddle onto the floor, I could have dressed that down a lot nicer. Like I said, I took these images from somewhere else, but just to kind of give you an idea of those 3 different scenarios. So here I thought it'd be interesting just to kind of show you a basic window, a pair of draperies, kind of using all the fundamental measurements and rules that we had talked about previously. So in this situation here, I found an image on the net that basically this pretty much shows a drapery rod that's extended 4 inches past each side and then finials on top of that. It's approximately 4 inches above the window. You can tell because most pleats are 4 inches tall, and you can see that that's approximately 4 inches above the window. So that's a basic look that you'd be looking at, a basic fit drapery. Here again, these are all minimums. You can do, lots of different things, but just to kind of give you an idea of a custom drapery, they've got returns, all those things that we talked about. And finally, kind of in this last section, or getting toward the end, I have people ask me all the time, how do you order for drapery side panels or accent panels or decorative panels? And what I tell them, there's really no, that I know of anyway, maybe you do, but there's no exact science to doing that because people are looking for different looks. You might have, as shown in this illustration up here, you might have someone that wants the rod 4 inches off the window, and if the window's extra wide or whatever, maybe they want the fabric to come on the window 15 inches or so. These are all hypothetical. You might have a situation where you want the rod to be 20 inches off the wall, and the panels just to maybe hang 4 inches onto the glass or onto the window. So you can see it's basically you take a tape measure, you get up to the window, you take things into consideration about how wide the window is. If it's extra wide, then you can afford to probably have more fabric hang on the glass. If it's a narrower window, you probably want the clearance, so you're not going to do as much. But once you determine and add the return and once you determine the size, then you simply have to add the return and the overlap. So for example, if I took the one on the bottom, which was the 20 inch off the glass and 4 inches on the 24-inch size, I would simply take that size and then I would add 1 return because I'm doing a panel on one side, and then I would do a 2-inch overlap. So for example, I would be ordering a finished width of 30. Kind of say that again, the bottom number shows the rod 20 inches off the left-hand side of the window and 4 inches onto the glass. So that gives me an overall bracket to bracket or coverage of 24 inches. To that, I would add 1 return because it's a panel. I'd add 1 overlap because it's a panel, and that would give me my finished width or my ordering width of 30 inches. So another consideration when you're doing decorative side panels is to think about the overall look. In the previous example, we ended up with ordering a panel that was 30 inches when you added the return and the overlap. So basically it was only going to cover about 24 inches of rod face. And to do that, if it's pleated, you have to pull it real tight, stretch it real tight and, kind of keep it in that position to cover that full 24-inch face. So one of the tricks in the industry that people like to do is they want their side panels to look more relaxed or like they're part way being drawn open or whatever. So all you would need to do is take that 30 inches and add 30% to it, or 3 times 3 is an additional 9 inches, to get a more relaxed look of the drapery as shown in the little diagram on the top right hand corner. So you get a little break in between the pleats versus being pulled real taut. So in this case I would end up ordering the drapery 39 inches overall. And then you can even take it a step further if you wanted the drapery that's when it's in the open position, or what we'll call the stacked position, when they're stacked, when they're pulled open, and you want the pleats to pretty much touch. You can actually take that, that initial size of 30 inches, you could add 80% to it, and that would probably get you into a position where the draperies are looking like they're in the stacked or open position. So keep in mind, just little things, little nuances you can add to the drapery to achieve a different look. But I know probably the most used one is adding 30%, and that gives the pleats a little relaxation in between. They look relaxed, and it's a pretty nice look. So kind of winding down, and in conclusion, I told you I wanted to kind of show you how easy it is to let our order entry system or CarolNet do all the work for you. So what we always kind of say, it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. We don't mean to say that your job is as easy as 1, 2, 3, but once you get your measurements and you're ready to write an order form or put it into the system, we've made it as easy as 1, 2, 3. So when you log on to CarolNet, what happens is you'll get a screen, and all you do is follow the little prompts. And this says here, if you're going to do draperies, you'd click on the little drapery icon and it would take you to the next screen. Then once you selected what category of product you wanted to do, you'd have the opportunity to go, in this case here we're doing a drapery, you could go in and you could again select on the little window for the type of drapery that you want to do. So it's very, very menu driven. It's just kind of click your way. So in this case here, if we were going to do a drapery, I'd just say I'd click on pleated style of drapery. So when I selected that I wanted to do a pleated drapery style, then again it's going to open up once again and it's going to show you all the different styles of pleated draperies that we do. So let's just say, for example, I wanted to do a pinch pleated drapery, or what we're calling a French pleat or a pinch pleated drapery. I'd just click on that window and it would take me to the next screen. So what happens is when you go to the actual drapery screen, this really is your spec sheet, and just watch how easy this is to do. All I'm going to do is I would put in quantity 1, I'd tell it that I want a pair, and then I would say I wanted 100 inches wide, which is my finished width including overlaps and returns that we learned today. I would do my finished length, let's say of 89, my returns are 4. In this case I selected the fullness. Remember we talked about that earlier, so I'm going to do 2.5 to 1 fullness, or you could have selected to put in your own number of widths. Either way, you want Carol to pin it, so you select pinning, and then you tell us what type of rod you're using so we know where to put the pin set. Then you pick a type of lining that you want to use, so we're going to use a standard lining. So in this case over here, I would go over and I would click and I would put in the classic sateen lining, and then I would go over there and put in my fabric, which is very simple. In this case here we're using a fabric called Donny Dogwood. And think about it. What just happened there? What just happened? You just filled out your whole spec sheet. You put your fabric in. The system's gone out and done a stock check for you, so you know the fabric's in stock. Now really all you have left to do is price it and order it. So on the next screen, now you have the ability to calculate it. You do that simply by hitting calculate, and before you know it, you have a price. And keep in mind, you can have the system set at retail or wholesale, whatever works for you. You could be in the consumer's home, you have it set at retail, you click it, you have a net price of $300.50. You add your taxes and whatever other things, your installation, whatever, and boom, it's done. That easier for you. There's some other really cool things in here that when we do a webinar on CarolNet, strongly suggest that you attend, because we can get in to show you all the embedded help files. We can break down the pricing into components, lots of different things. But from here, all you would do is hit add to cart and then just follow it through a checkout procedure. And before you know it, you've, like I said, you've got your spec sheet filled out. You've, all the things that we've learned today. You've reduced the number of errors that can happen in the business. Your pricing's 100% guaranteed. It's just a really smart way of doing business. So I hope that next time you order a drapery from Carol, you'll strongly consider using our online CarolNet order entry system. Well, this concludes our webinar today. I really want to thank you for taking the time to view it. I hope what we talked about will be helpful to you and interesting, and we look forward to doing some more along these lines. So we once again appreciate you. Hope you have a great day selling, and we'll say goodbye for now. Thanks. Bye-bye.